Fear No Evil, Chapter 2. Toshinori stared at his phone in horror. He cursed himself for not checking his texts sooner. Humarise had been approaching young Midoriya, and they knew about a connection between the two of them. Flashes of memory came back to Toshinori, singing and the smell of incense, the fogginess in his head from the drugs, the room of enlightenment. Wetness everywhere, and he couldn't move. The old woman with sad brown eyes who'd pushed a key into his hands and whispered, "It's too late for me, I'm too old. But you're just a child, Toshi, you have to get out." He could never let them put young Midoriya through the same thing they'd done to him. Toshinori took flight, leaping from roof to roof. Before knocking on the Midoriya door, Toshinori transformed into his All Might form. He hadn't met Izuku's parents yet, but he knew people instinctively trusted All Might. This way, they would be more likely to believe him about the threat posed by Humarise. When the door opened, he boomed, "Thank you, ma'am, I'm here." "Are you here about Izuku's kidnapping?" The green-haired woman stared up at him with eyes red from crying. "Please, does someone finally believe me?" "Kidnapping," Toshinori whispered. He'd been too late. He'd failed his successor. In the living room, Inko Midoriya poured out her story of a son who never returned home and a police cover-up. In turn, Toshinori told her about training Izuku for the UA entrance exam, although not about One for All. Inko wiped away a tear. "I knew Izuku was training with someone lately. He seemed so happy, and he's always been your biggest fan. It must have been a dream come true for him. And now—" She broke down sobbing again. "I believe you." Toshinori patted her on the back. "I have no doubt at all that young Midoriya was kidnapped. Humarise is bad news. I've had dealings with them in the past. Unfortunately, they have an illicit influence on the government and police. They're an old organization, from the dawn of the Age of Quirks. Even after their side lost the battle against Quirks, they have roots very deep into the systems of power." In his early days as a hero, when he'd been younger and more reckless, Toshinori had almost lost his hero license trying to take on Humarise. Now he was older, wiser, and also out of fucks to give. Humarise had dared to take his successor from him. They had crossed a line. He would no longer hold back and let the consequences be damned. Toshinori stood up. "I'm going to find your son. I'll leave at once. Do you have anyone to stay with you?" "My husband hasn't even returned one call since I told him what happened," Inko's tone filled with bitterness. "Even Izuku getting kidnapped isn't enough to make him take time off work. He'd rather try to buy his way out of this by promising me a private detective." She blew her nose into her handkerchief. "I'll call a friend. Don't you worry about me. Just find my boy." "I promise," Toshinori vowed. The problem with Humarise had always been not fighting them in combat, but rather finding them first. Humarise had many churches, but most of them were full of deluded people who genuinely had no idea about the kidnappings. Their leaders stayed in isolated locations and sent disposable people out to do their dirty work. Toshinori had made arrests before, but he'd never managed to get his hands on a leader because they never went out in the open. Flecht Turn hadn't left his base in an unknown location in Europe for years. Every time Toshinori caught a cultist in a crime, Humarise excelled at denying all responsibility and denouncing that member as a rogue. The cultists had all killed themselves before they ever stood trial. The cultists had a quirk to block detection from search or related abilities. They'd gotten it from All for One, who'd handed out copies across the underworld for years before Toshinori had taken him down. That bastard's legacy still lingered. Toshinori had spent several hours going over all his known records concerning Humarise. He knew they had a secret base in Japan. They had one in most countries. No matter what, he couldn't let them take Izuku out of the country. Toshinori found what he believed to be their supply chain. In the past, he'd stalled at this point, always unable to gather enough evidence to arrest the suppliers. This time, he arrested them anyway. When Toshinori showed up at Detective Tsukouchi's office, his old friend was red-faced and furious. "Toshinori, how could you arrest so many people without a warrant? We're going to have to let them go. To all outside appearances, they're just ordinary businessmen who happen to sell food, clothing, and medical supplies to Humarise. I'm sorry, Toshinori said. I'm even more sorry for what I'm about to ask you. He dropped to his knees and lowered his head to the floor. No, Masa, please, before you release the Humarise agents, use your quirk on them to find out where their hidden base is located. Toshi, stop! Tsukuuchi tried to drag his friend to his feet. Toshinori remained stubbornly planted with his forehead to the ground. These aren't legitimate arrests, so I can't interrogate them under lie detection. If afterward we failed to find this hidden base full of kidnapped quirkless that you believe in so fervently, then I'd lose my job and you'd lose your hero license. Toshinori whispered, The base exists. I've been there. I was a prisoner there for nearly 2 years. But Humarise will try to take your job even if we succeed. They have power and influence spread across the world. Destroying one base won't even slow them down. I know I'm being unfair to ask this of you. But please. He dug his forehead deeper into the carpet. They took my successor. Tsukuuchi sucked in a breath. I'm very sorry. Tsukuuchi knew how much Izuku meant to him, since the detective had been the recipient of long, glowing rants about the boy at their regular lunches. Toshinori said, You know what Humarise did to me. Tsukuuchi nodded. He'd taken down official testimony during Toshinori's court case against the few scapegoats Humarise had tossed up to accept all the blame. He'd also held Toshinori's hand through the screaming nightmares. Toshinori said, You know how much they hate me, because I obtained a quirk. It's the worst possible abomination to them for someone quirkless to become tainted. I'm their personal devil. Humarise had tried to kill Toshinori countless times through his hero career. Several times, they'd used suicide bombers. Tsukuuchi's gaze went to the scar that one such attack had left on Toshinori's neck. Toshinori said, They took young Midoriya right after I gave him One for All. It will activate inside him soon, and before he learns how to control it, he might not be able to hide it. If they find out that he has a quirk, then they'll kill him. The words hung in the air between them like the blade of a guillotine. Of course, Toshinori had known about the danger Izuku faced from the moment he'd learned of the kidnapping, but he hadn't dared to say it out loud, for fear that would somehow make it more real. Please, Toshinori whispered. I have money. If you lose your job, I'll pay for your early retirement. I know that's not enough. I know that you love your job. I know I'm asking you to go against your principles, but I need you. Please. Stop begging. Tsukuuchi grabbed his friend and hauled him to his feet. His face was grim, but resolved. I'll help you. Only once back in his office did Toshinori allow himself to shed tears. Just a few, then straight back to work. He called every hero who owed him a favor or who had a friendly relationship with him, asking them to look for Humarise agents. He called Gran Torino. After only a moment's hesitation, he called Sir Night-Eye. This was far more important than any awkwardness. As soon as he hung up the phone, someone behind him spoke. You lost your successor to Humarise? This is perfect. A deep male voice laughed delightedly. Here I thought I'd have to threaten to go on a murderous rampage across Japan to get your help. Toshinori's blood ran cold. He knew that laugh. He'd heard it in his nightmares. He turned around. The man behind him had barely a face, just scar tissue. His eyes were gone. Life support equipment covered his mouth. But Toshinori would know him anywhere. All for One still lived. It filled the hero with a mixture of shock, horror, and even despair. Then came the rage. Toshinori leapt forward, One for All crackling down his fist as he prepared to smash this ghost to oblivion. Whoa, All for One sidestepped. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to call a ceasefire. Ha, you look so skinny and sickly when you're not using One for All. Toshinori whirled around and threw himself at his fated enemy. Stop! You might damage the computer. All for One grabbed the monitor and pulled it out of the way. We need your information to find Humarise. We? Toshinori hissed. Are you insane? Have I gone insane and hallucinated you? I don't like it either, All for One scowled. But I need to destroy Humarise, and you have information to find them. We have a mutual enemy. Toshinori drew himself up to his full height and growled, You're my greatest enemy. I'm flattered, but I'm not the one who kidnapped this new successor of yours, All for One snickered. Don't look at me like that. Believe it or not, I don't want whichever foolish brat you picked to inherit One for All to die before I get my hands on my brother's quirk. We're honestly on the same side this time. You need me. I know all about the quirks of Humarise's leaders and their defenses. You probably know because you've been selling them technology, Toshinori growled. All for One shrugged. You still need me. Humarise specializes in building impenetrable fortresses. If they know about the boy's connection to you, they might take him hostage, so you ought to launch a sneak attack. I know the blueprints of their hideout because I helped design it. I just don't know where it is. We'll combine our knowledge. I'll let you play the hero and save all the poor innocent civilians. In exchange, I only want one thing that Humarise stole from me. Toshinori couldn't believe he was actually considering this. But Izuku's safety came before absolutely everything else. Will you agree to let me take all of the kidnapping victims with me alive and unharmed? An odd look flashed across what remained of All for One's face. All of them except one. No deal. I'm not going to harm him. He's the quirkless child of one of my closest followers. Is that why you fell out with Humarise? The main reason, yes. Toshinori gave his nemesis a hard stare. You're lying. You'd never go so far for someone else's child. Toshinori couldn't imagine anything so valuable that it would bring All for One to the doorstep of his greatest enemy, wanting an alliance so badly that he'd come as close as an egomaniac could to begging. Unless... Humarise took your son? The pure look of horror on All for One's face gave him away. Naturally, the villain still tried to deny it. That's absolutely ridiculous. Who the hell would ever reproduce with the likes of you? Toshinori shrieked. All for One scowled. I used to be quite handsome before you ripped off my face. It's not your face that's too ugly to love. It's your personality. Just seconds before this turned into another brawl, the office doors flung open. Shota Aizawa stood framed by the darkness of the hallway. His eyes were bloodshot. He wore only a hospital gown. A pressure cuff dangled off his arm. He didn't even look at All for One. Focusing on Toshinori, he growled, All Might, I heard you're the hero expert on Humarise. I need you to help me find a kidnapping victim. My, Humarise is pissing off so many people today, All for One muttered with a note of gleeful amusement. Toshinori asked, What happened to you? Should you be walking around? Aizawa grunted, I'm fine. Those idiots at the hospital are overly cautious. He yanked the pressure cuff off and threw it on the ground. Humarise tried to kidnap me, and a teenage boy intervened to save me. They took him instead of me. Pain shook through his voice. I have to find him. As Toshinori met Aizawa's eyes, they shared an understanding. They were both heroes. Toshinori knew that if a child had been taken in his place, he'd never be able to forgive himself. He'd never rest until he found the boy. There was no stopping Aizawa. Toshinori didn't bother to try. I'll help you, I promise. Aizawa snarled. When I woke up in the hospital, the police refused to believe that there had been an attempted kidnapping at all. They wouldn't even put out an alert. They tried to tell me the kid must have run away from home when I watched him get dragged off into a van in front of me. Toshinori nodded. Humarise has many agents among the police. Most of their kidnappings never get reported as crimes. Aizawa hissed behind his teeth. How do people not know about this? I've been trying to tell them for years, but the media won't talk about it. Government officials have repeatedly shut me down. Now Humarise kidnapped a quirkless boy I've been training, and I'm no longer playing by the rules. Toshinori bared his teeth. Who are you looking for? The determined look on Aizawa's face faltered. I don't know his name. You don't know his name? We didn't exactly have time to introduce ourselves, but I'll know him if I see his face again. Toshinori said, We're planning to rescue all the captives, so we ought to be able to find yours in the same place. All for One shrugged. I suppose you're not going to let me take Erasure, so it would be useful to have Eraserhead on our side. We? Aizawa looked at All for One for the first time. Who's he? A villain, Toshinori said. But Humarise took his son, so he's willing to give us information on them. All for One growled. New rule of our alliance. You don't tell anyone that I have a son. Toshinori said, Then I have a rule in exchange. You don't harm any civilians during this mission. You don't kill anyone. I know you're strong enough to take enemies alive, don't make that face. Also, you don't investigate the identity of my successor, and no stealing quirks from anyone on my side. That's 4 rules. Toshinori stared him down. I'm guessing that you really don't want your enemies to know that you have a son. A lot of them are much worse than me, people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt a child. You've learned how to blackmail, how lovely, All for One sneered. Then we have a ceasefire, until we all find the children we're looking for. Toshinori's smile was equally cold. And then the ceasefire ends. The phone rang. The caller ID said it was Detective Tsukauchi. Toshinori lunged for the phone. I have to take this. It's about the case. Izuku had a dull aching in the back of his head. He cracked open one eye. White. Everywhere. Blinding. Immediately, he closed his eyes. After a few deep breaths, the events of the day came rushing back to him. He had been kidnapped by a cult. He couldn't just laze around. He had to escape. He tried to rise. As soon as he sat up, a jab of pain went through his temples. He winced. His left arm throbbed. Looking down, he saw a gauze pad and a bandage on the crook of his elbow. Someone had drawn his blood while he'd been asleep. Don't try to move, a soft, gentle voice said. He felt the pillow under his head and sheets around his body. He'd expected a worse prison, or at least handcuffs, but his arms and legs felt free. He ventured to open his eyes again. A woman with mint-green hair leaned over him. For a moment, he believed it was Barros, but she looked much older, with curly hair and a rounder face. She held out a cup of water. Izuku stared at it, trying to figure out if it was drugged. His throat throbbed. She took a sip, then handed the cup to him. Izuku could imagine a scenario where she'd slowly built up her immunity to poison for years, but he decided not to be quite that paranoid. He didn't think he could talk without water for his dry throat. He drank. He glanced around the room. It was entirely white, from the walls to the ceiling to the pure white bed he lay in. He could barely make out the door among the sameness. There didn't seem to be any other furniture. This space was only the size of a closet. Although he hadn't been restrained, the room had been stripped of all sharp objects. Where am I? He asked, focusing on the woman. Her eyes empty, she smiled. You're home. End of chapter 2. Omake time. Omake. Just wait until Aizawa enters the competition. Toshinori. It appears that your husband is an asshole. Is your son in the market for a new father figure? Inko. If you're offering All Might, then he'd be delighted. Toshinori. Then it's a deal. All for One. Why do I suddenly feel extremely pissed off and also concerned? Omake. The genesis of All for One's highly reluctant bromance adventure with All Might. All for One. More quirks for me? This cult is A-okay. I'm going to give them funding, scientific advancements, and protection because it will piss off All Might and be funny. I'll even use them to obtain erasure. That definitely won't backfire on me. Humarise. Kidnaps Izuku. All for one. Well, well, if it isn't my greatest nemesis, the consequences of my own actions. Later. All for one. Popping up in All Might's home. Hey, stop screaming. I need your help. My son has been kidnapped by a cult and they won't let me see him. Hashtag someone else vaulted Izuku before AFO could. This means war. What an awful cult, driving All for One into the arms of All Might. Omake. And someone doodled on the guards' faces. All Might. How did you get into my tower so easily? I thought I had better security. Aizawa. All the alarms were disabled and the guards were asleep. I just strolled right in. All Might. Ah, so it was All for One. I guess I should count myself lucky he didn't kill anyone, probably because he needed my help. Omake. If All Might didn't recognize All for One. All Might. Who are you and what are you doing in my home? All for One. You've gotta be kidding me. I'm your arch nemesis. All Might. You look like a sick, blind old man. You must be confused. I'll take you to the hospital. All for One. Sighs, pulls out a tie, and fastens it badly around his neck. Does this help? All Might. Only one person can mangle a tie so badly. All for One.